We're now going to take a look at one of the new spline features, which is the ecosystem alignment to the spline. And instances will have their rotation oriented to move along with the spline. So first thing we need to do is create a spline for this scene. It's just a simple procedural terrain, nothing too complex in the function. What I want to do is basically create a spline that kind of goes down this valley. If we can see that just showing up in the top view. So I'm just going to create a spline and just bring it out from the outside of the terrain a bit. Go ahead and zoom in a little closer for the other portions of this. And then I'm just going to go ahead and create some points within the perspective view. And we'll just need to edit those just a little. So I'm just going to go to the edit mode and just kind of smooth that out. And it looks like one of the points over here is either there just isn't enough, or just going too far across here. I'm going to grab that point and just move it down and see if I can angle it up, and then we're just going to go ahead and resample the spline after this. So I would select the spline, edit the object, and go to resample. And that looks like it should be pretty good. Now, because of the nature of the way the spline roll works, we will actually need to basically create another type of spline to avoid the angle and the tilting, which we'll see in just a minute. So now that we've got our spline, what we can do is edit the object. And I'm going to go to the ecosystem effect, turn that on. And what we want to do is populate with an ecosystem. And then what we can do is edit the material. So right now we're taking a look at the stroke method for this. And what I'm going to do is add in an object I created, an animated object of a wind turbine. And I am going to switch my default quality for this just over to smooth shaded so we can see the full quality. I want to make a few changes before I go ahead and populate. We're going to go to the scaling and orientation, and we're going to set the size variation to 0 because I don't want to have any size variation for this. I want them all to be the same size. Under the rotation, the maximum rotation and the kind of randomness that's built into this rotation will work along with the spline alignment, and I don't want any additional rotation. I just want to kind of have it go around and follow the spline. So we're just turning off that up axis only, and we also want to make sure that the direction from surface is set to 0% going to vertical. Now, it doesn't quite work perfectly. It is going to orient itself to the terrain whenever you start aligning the objects. So first let's just go ahead and populate it without an alignment. Looks like there's very few instances right now. What we can do is force the regular alignment of instances, and that's going to evenly space them. And then we can just knock down the density. And I think I am going to maybe reduce the overall scaling a little bit. Okay, so if we take a look at it right now, everything is going to basically be pointing upwards, but we don't have any rotation without the alignment on. You can see, especially where we have these bent joints, just everything's facing the same direction. I do want to have it kind of move along with the spline. So we can go into back to edit the spline, and we're going to check the align instance along spline. And we can go back and repopulate. And now what we're going to see is all of those objects are going to follow along with the spline. Now the other feature that's along with the instance alignment is the ability to rotate the instances around the spline direction. So in other words, if you have the spline banked along the sides or certain directions, the new banking features, and have the points rotated, it will move along the other axis and sort of roll around the side. We don't really need that right now, but one thing you can tell by looking even in the main camera view is that we do have a bit of tilting. And we can see that when we're on steeper slopes, and it's basically going to match the surface normal of the terrain. Even though we do have it set to the vertical mode, it is showing up perpendicular. And it doesn't look like that's going to be something that's going to be changed with this current version. So if I go ahead and just switch over to the perspective view, we should be able to see what's going on with these instances and the tilt a little better. And you can really see they're leaning to the side quite a bit. And that's really not going to be something that's going to work. One thing I'm going to do really quick to trigger the animation and give some variation in the rotation of the turbine, I'm going to edit the object, go into the ecosystem, and actually I will have to move it over to a new spline, so we'll just wait a minute on that. First, let's just go ahead and correct this leaning. And for that, what we need to do is create another type of spline, or another spline. We can't use the current one, and I could have just created the flat spline, or the one we're going to create right now first, but you really can't see what happens then, and why it's important to create it the other way. One thing I did try when I was first running into this problem was going into the spline and attempting to change the up and down axis scale, the Z scale in this case, and set it to 0. The only problem is it does affect the objects when you do that, and it ended up creating basically flat planes out of all of the objects. It was kind of interesting. So you do need to have a spline that is going to be a unit of 1 throughout. If you go to the aspect tab up here, or the numerics tab up at the top, go to size, what we can do is turn off the true object unit size and see that it's 1 all the way across. So the spline does need to be like that, and if you scale it on the Z, it will mess everything up. So what we need is basically something to project onto. We're going to be creating points. In order to speed things up here, edit the material, and we can just clear it. And we will end up basically just removing that from that spline. And we could use a ground plane, or we can use a flat terrain. We just need to have something that's above the current terrain, but still be able to see where the current points are, because I do want to use the same layout. And this way, if you do have a spline set up maybe a road that's affecting the terrain, or using a terrain effect, you can match it as best you can and still use the ecosystem effect to kind of go around it. And that way you don't lose any features. I also want to note that resampling or pathfinding also won't work for flattening this out and dropping it. And if we were to go through point by point and drop the individual points, we would still have a lot of rotation that would cause problems with the instance in the way the instances are rotated. So I'm just going to add another infinite plane, make sure it's above the terrain, and I'm going to go over to the aspect tab and set the visibility to hidden. And that way we can still see everything underneath it. And what I'm going to do is create a spline and just start to mimic the outline. And we'll go ahead and fix that point later. And then we'll switch to the editing mode. We can control click on the points and just adjust the curves. And there we have a nice flat spline, and it matches for the most part what we have on the terrain. We could choose to resample this if you want. It can, in some cases, even out the spacing between the instance objects, but I'll only worry about that if it becomes an issue. So what I'm going to do for now is create a new layer and put that infinite plane in it, and we're going to hide it and make sure it's not rendering. And that way it shouldn't interfere with anything. If I go to create a new spline, say, I should be able to ignore it. So just go ahead and cancel that. So what we're going to do is use this new spline, and we can go into the other one, just edit the object. And we can turn off the ecosystem. If you want, you could save the values you have. I'm just going to re-enter them really quickly. We can just turn off the ecosystem effect on the first spline. Go into the second one, and just set this back up. We're going to align along the spline. What we're going to do is populate with an ecosystem, and we're going to select only selected objects. And what we want to do is populate on the procedural terrain 100%. And then we'll go into the ecosystem material, and I'm just going to re-add that object. Go back to the scale, set it to 0, make sure there's no rotation, set to vertical, because this time vertical will work. Reduce the overall scaling a little bit, force regular alignment of instances. I'm going to turn off the decay near foreign objects. Turn it to smooth shaded mode, populate. We'll reduce the density a bit. Say about 12% for the density. So now I'm also going to set up the animation. So we're going to go to the animation tab, and I'm going to turn on the variable time offset. Each turbine rotates it does a full rotation every 8 seconds. So I'll set that to 8 seconds, and then set the variation number to 43. And we can loop the animation phasing. And now everything should be straight up and down. The animation won't show for the preview of the instances, but it will show up at render time. So now we've got them all straightened out, and then we can still use the other spline to do the terrain effect. I also want to note that the stroke width, or the size we see when we open up the editor, right now it's set to 3 meters. So that's going to be a 3-meter variability. I'll go ahead and increase this up to 27 and repopulate, and we're going to see it scatter the instances around the spline a bit more. And you can see them start to kind of jump around away from the spline. Increase it to 50 and populate. And then it creates a different type of fill area. And now, because I do have the force regular alignment of instances turned on, it doesn't fill in as much. If we turn that off, we can see it populating around the spline more, but still using the direction. So that way we could spread things out if you wanted to have multiple groupings. But I'm going to turn force regular alignment of instances back on, and I'm going to take the stroke width and bring it almost all the way down as close to 0 as you can get it, and that way it will stick very close to the spline in the spacing. And after getting a little bit of a closer look at this, I think I'm going to space this out a little more. We can decrease the density. And I think I'm going to maybe keep the camera down here. And then I'm going to change the sun. And we'll go ahead and just set it up. Radiosity, gain -0.5. Adjust the light balance a little. Pull back the focal a little. And sometimes you just need to kind of scrub through the timeline just a little in order to get the instances shifting. So I made just a couple of renders to look at. Here's one where I made it more of a early morning lighting, and I also reduced the scale of the instances and increased the amount. Another one looking a little more towards the sky. One where you can see the turbine a little closer, although the anti-aliasing was a little lower on this one, so it does look a little jagged. And this is just another render I had made, just kind of taking a look at the turbine. Just populated a few of them. We got some clouds in there. Different scaling overall with them, but you can see a lot of detail on them overall. I do believe that's a slightly different version model because of the darker areas around the turbine. What I want to show you right now are some of the things I had to do in order to get the wind turbine object to animate properly, since it does involve individual components. And I had a lot of issues when they were within a grouped container with the objects being offset from each other or just not animating at all. Because a lot of times when it's within a group, the animation is destroyed, unless it's set up with bones and a different type of animation setup. So what I want to do is first just load in the object. Now, when I loaded this in, you can see something rather strange has happened, and that is that the fins, or the rotating section, is not lined up at all with the pole. Now, once I start scrubbing through the timeline, and another important thing is when you're setting this up, make sure that you have auto keyframing turned off, or it will cause a lot of issues. Once you start animating it and you've got your position set up correctly, then you can start worrying about those keyframes. But if it's turned on, it'll mess things up. So even though I loaded, this is just a single object. So I went to load the object. It's just one object, but two objects came in, and that's because of the way I saved it. I'm going to go ahead and scrub the timeline, and what we can see is that the object corrects itself because it's shifting to the keyframes I had set up. So the way that this is rotating is, if we take a look at the fin section, I've got the pivot right in the center of this object. So I did have to have the objects exported or imported in as separate objects in order to give me a correct pivot. The way the animation is set up is we go to the Motion tab, we can go to the Animation Toolbox. I've just got a repeat animation set up and set to spin on the x-axis. It is turned now, so it actually would be rotating on the y if I was to set it up right now, but I did have this originally facing the side view and then changed it afterwards. So it is rotating. The local axis is the x. So negative 45 degrees per second, so that's 8 seconds per revolution. So then what I did was, after that was animated correctly, I lined it up with the main section and then just kind of positioned those in place. So once they were lined up, I went and added keyframe to all properties for both of the objects. One thing you want to make sure you do if you're setting something up like this is make sure that the objects are not linked to each other in any way. That was one of the problems I was having, is the links were causing that offset like we had when I first loaded in the object when the fin section was way down lower. The animated instances looked like that. Anytime I got the animation to work, it would be offset and not correct. So make sure that there's no linking in that case. And what we want to do is, when we save the object, you just select the individual pieces. You can hold down the control key and select the individual pieces, or you can hold down shift if you've got a large list of individual objects. The main thing is getting them out of the imported groups that tend to show up when you import an object. Once those two are selected, what you can do is save the object, and that creates a group object, which is why in the ecosystem we had, when we were aligning it to the spline, it was just called group, even though I loaded in an object called wind turbine. Now I've just gone ahead and reloaded in or imported the original object, and as you can see, all of different sections, every single piece has its own group. So the main thing was getting the parts that are going to be rotating grouped as one, and ungrouping everything. And then of course setting up the materials. The main reason I exported it this way, or imported in as individual pieces, was to give me a little more control over the materials. But one thing that did happen was, once I started ungrouping, I did lose some of my pivot points. So one thing is just go through and I'm just ungrouping everything to get all of the different objects. Now, one thing I want to show you is that once all of these were uh, ungrouped, and I basically had to group them back to each other, you'll notice that the pivot location is off, and we do have a few objects that are kind of stray. So what I had to do to realign the pivot, because moving the view pivot point doesn't permanently fix the issue, it just actually causes more issues. So you have to find a way to, if you've already got it in view and you have, say, no way to go into your other program, or you spent a lot of time already getting the materials ready, you're not going to go back and export everything over again as new objects. You do need to be able to correct the pivot. So I just want to show you how I did that. First thing is to position this at 0. So wherever we want the center pivot to be, we need to position this entire object to be right in the middle of everything. So you just got to line up. I've got like a little needle kind of on the end, and I'm just using that in order to center it. And then I'll go ahead and move it back. And now what I'm going to do is bake this to polygons. And then I'm going to add another object, a sphere, and make sure that this is completely centered. And I'm going to assign a material to this, call it null, connect it to the group. We're going to group the objects, so with the previous group plus the sphere, bake it to polygons, and then we're going to edit the object, go to split, just going to break apart all the pieces, and what we should be able to do is delete the null. And as you can see, the group for this, the pivot, is now in the correct position. And then we can, if we want to make it one object again, bake it to polygons. And it looks like the view just got a little messed up at the preview. Just set that back to smooth shaded. And now I have a pivot where I can properly rotate it. It does look like maybe it's a tiny bit off. So I could go in and adjust that a little further. But the OpenGL is varied for the perspective view, so it's better just to go through the top views and side views. So then what we could do is create our animation or keyframes and then start lining that up. So that is kind of an important step if you're going to be able to get animated objects like this to work with the ecosystems.